Thanks very much. It's a privilege to address you. This audience is full of just the sort of people for whom I wrote The Bottom Billion. Now, I'm conscious that many of you have already read it, and that quite a few of you have already been at the TED conference where I spoke just 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I want to say something that is not in the book. It builds on the book and is different from what I said at TED. So here goes. Now, those of you who were at TED will remember that I had the misfortune to be the speaker before Al Gore. And I stick to the strategy I adopted then, which is if you're followed by Al Gore, don't try a PowerPoint. But I must say, to be followed by Al Gore once in a lifetime is a misfortune. Twice in a month sounds like a habit. So how can social entrepreneurs help the bottom billion? That seems to be the key issue for today. And let me start with a couple of sort of ideas that are already out there. And one is that the bottom billion, these awfully poor people, represent a market opportunity, the bottom of the pyramid type thing. I'm, to be honest, a little bit skeptical of that the bottom billion are tiny markets, and when we look at them as a market, we focus on their role as consumers, whereas actually the key opportunity for the bottom billion is not that these people are consumers, it's that they're producers, and astoundingly unproductive producers. And the opportunity and the challenge is to bring entrepreneurship to them in such a way as to make them more productive producers. That is going to be my core message to you. Now, how do we do that? How do we raise their productivity as producers? Well, another big idea that's out there is microfinance, microcredit. And great but. And the but is that really, I think, doesn't harness your core skill. And your core skill is not just money, it's business expertise. And that is in short supply in these conditions. So let's try and harness money with business expertise and raise the productivity of workers in the bottom billion. And then my final point before I get into detail is that we need to do that in a way that is strategic, so that the individual efforts at the micro level scale up into a strategy that makes macro sense for the opportunities facing the country. Now, what do ordinary people need in these societies of the bottom billion? The bottom billion are a bunch of 60 or so countries that have been pretty stagnant for the last 40 years and so have diverged radically from the rest of mankind. What do they need? Well, they need jobs and they need basic social services. And let me start with jobs. Less than 1 in 10 of the labour force in the societies of the bottom billion is in any sort of formal wage employment. That's a disaster. And so first order is jobs. And now let's try and think strategically about how the opportunities for job creation differ according to the conditions in these societies. I'm going to give you 3 strategic opportunities according to differences in conditions. And let me start with a cluster of countries that are coastal countries and resource scarce. Take 3 examples. There's Senegal, coastal, resource scarce. Kenya, Madagascar. Now, what sort of opportunities are open to that cluster of countries? Well, the answer is, I mean, in a way, it's blindingly obvious. It's the East Asian model. East Asia broke in, used its coastal resource-scarce characteristics to break in to labor-intensive manufactures. And the genius of that strategy is it can create millions of jobs very fast. And that comes out of the basic economics of export manufacturing, which is clusters of export activities. I'm going to give you the one thing you'll remember in a year's time, right? which is about buttons. Right? And it's that 65% of the world's buttons are made in one city. Right? Don't you think that's amazing? Right? And it's not because Mega Button Incorporated happens to be located there. Right? There is no Mega Button Incorporated. It's that lots and lots of little button firms find that by clustering together, they bring their costs down. Right? That's why my export manufacturing occurs in clusters. Clusters at a port. Right? And now imagine you're going to be the first button manufacturer in Mombasa. Right? It's not going to work, is it? No matter how good the government of Kenya manages to make the policy environment in Kenya, and in the last couple of months it hasn't been doing a great job, has it? But no matter how good it gets it, the first button firm not in that cluster is going to make losses. Right? Now that tells you that the message from this basic economics of clustering is that there's a coordination problem. If only firms would coordinate, form a cluster in Dakar, in Senegal, in Mombasa, in Kenya, right? Then they'd mutually bring each other's costs down. Right? But nobody wants to be the first. And so it doesn't happen. There's a chicken and egg problem. Right? So how do we get the coordination? In the bottom billion, and more generally since, what I've been trying to promote is the idea that Western governments can help that coordination through their trade policy. Give the bottom billion temporary privileged access to our markets by removing all the impediments, the trade barriers that we currently place there. America's already done that to some extent with a scheme called AGOA, and that works. It's increased African garment exports to America 7-fold in 5 years. It's just that America's the wrong market, and AGOA isn't very well designed. Right? What we need is a super AGOA that applies across the OECD. But that is coordination coming from Western governments. Another possibility is coordination coming from entrepreneurs. Right? If manufacturers got together and linked with retailers in OECD markets, they could lower the risks of getting started, of building a cluster in these environments. And these countries are small enough that one cluster would make a huge difference. Right? It could create hundreds of thousands of jobs and make the difference between stability and fragility. So that's the coastal model. We press on to another opportunity group, which is not a very good opportunity group. It's the countries that are landlocked and resource scarce. Yeah? And that's Africa. About a third of Africa's population is living in countries with those characteristics. Outside Africa, it's 1% of the population. Yeah? Because another way of putting those statistics is outside Africa, places that are landlocked and resource scarce haven't become countries. But in Africa, they did. Yeah? Those sort of countries don't have many options. The East Asian model of export manufacturing is out because they can't get access to the coast. The transport costs are prohibitive. Right? They haven't got resource riches, and so that option isn't there. So what is there? Right? Yes, there's agriculture, but agriculture is not the royal rapid road to prosperity. So what else can we do? Is there anything a bit more modern? And of course the answer is yes, there is. E-services. You don't need a coast for e-services. Right? Call centres. Right? Where are the call centres at the moment? They're in India. Where do they need to be? They need to be in countries like Uganda, Rwanda, Burkina Faso. Right? The twin pillars of e-services are education and telecoms. And again, it's a coordination problem. Because the call centres are not there, there's no lobby pressing the government for good education standards and for good telecoms facilities. Yeah? If the lobby was there, it would be sustainable, but the lobby isn't there. Yeah? So again, it's a coordination problem. You can do the coordination. Yeah? You can link up with educational charities to raise the standards in education and produce people who are employable in e-services. You can link up with the big traditional dinosaurs, the World Bank and so on, to create a pressure point for good telecoms. So that's the second opportunity, is taking e-services beyond India. E-services are actually starting to move out of India. Where are they moving to at the moment? The Philippines. Okay? So that's the good news, that locations outside India can be competitive. And the bad news is that at the moment, the countries that need that job opportunity most are not yet getting it. Let me turn to the third jobs opportunity. And this harnesses the two big shocks that have hit Africa in the last few years. Both favorable shocks. One is the shock of peace. Around the millennium, a lot of civil wars in Africa were settled. And so we've now got post-conflict situations, usually pretty fragile. The other big opportunity is, of course, the commodity booms, which are the biggest opportunity that the bottom billion have ever had. Right? Now, the problem is that both commodity booms and post-conflict situations are not inevitably good news. 40% of post-conflict situations go back into conflict. The last time there were the commodity booms in the 1970s, they were missed opportunities. Right? So there's no automatic process that harnesses either peace or high commodity prices to benefit the lives of ordinary people in a sustainable way. What's the transmission mechanism? There's one common transmission mechanism, both for the post-conflict economies and for the commodity boom economies, that maps onto job opportunities for ordinary people, and it's the construction sector. Post-conflict situations produce construction booms, reconstruction booms, and commodity booms invariably produce construction booms. And we're seeing that across the bottom billion at the moment. But construction booms can be either good news or bad news. In economic terms, it depends how steep the supply curve is in the construction sector. Typically, the supply curve is very steep. And what that means is that the big increase in demand for output of the construction sector just drives up prices. Those high prices mean that resources are being dissipated, and there are big political rents that are going to be contested and captured. Price booms are really bad news. What we want is to flatten that supply curve so that instead of very high prices, we get big increases in quantities. And what does that mean? Big increases in quantities potentially mean jobs, jobs for ordinary people, and in particular, for relatively unskilled young men. In post-conflict situations, that is the key to re-establishing a secure peace. Now, there's one way that African governments are currently using to flatten the supply curve, and that is Chinese construction companies. And that's the wrong answer. And if you think about it for a moment, you'll realize why. It gets the roads and the buildings built, and it completely bypasses the domestic economy. It produces no jobs at all. Yeah? And so what we need is action within the society, within the economy, to flatten the supply curve. And that's partly a matter of what are the bottlenecks? Just think through the bottlenecks in the construction sector. Some of you are experts in this sector. Yeah? There's a shortage of firms, the contracts are often not appropriate for the firms. There's a shortage of skills, and so there's a need for training in the basic mundane construction skills. I advise post-conflict societies that one of the first things they need to sequence is to open a college of construction technology, as it were. Because at the moment, during conflict, all these skills atrophy. Nobody's constructing anything during a civil war. The society is not in construction mode, it's in destruction mode. And so the skill sets get lost. The firms go bust. There's a need to re-establish all the features of that sector as fast as possible. So that's the third jobs opportunity. Let me close by turning from job opportunities to the provision of basic services, health services, education services, and the provision of basic services in difficult places. Think Liberia, Sierra Leone, Democratic Republic of Congo. These are the places on earth where social provision is a catastrophe. What can we do about it? Government provision is broken. It's the supply model which has failed. And in my view, in these societies, it's failed irredeemably. And we just have to face that. Reconstructing these societies as if they were the Europe of the 1950s with monopoly provision by state supply is just the wrong model for these societies. It didn't work and it won't work. At the other end of the spectrum, in the last decade, we've suffered the illusion that by micro-social action at the community level, we can just pump prime communities to self-supply. So we pump prime, we set up schools or clinics or whatever, and expect the community then to take over the running of it. That's the wrong model. There's now accumulating evidence, really hard evidence, that these things are not sustainable. Of course they're not sustainable. Just think for a moment. I live in North Oxford. If the community of North Oxford is one of the richest on earth, but if it was given the task of sustaining its own schools and hospitals, it wouldn't happen. Right? And now we're dealing with the poorest societies on earth, societies where the community has been fractured by conflict and poverty, and we expect them to take over social services which anywhere else in the world have a sustained element of public financing. So that model's wrong as well. What we need is a model in which there is sustained public financing, but private provision. Private provision by social entrepreneurs, by not-for-profits, NGOs, churches, whatever works. Parallel systems of supply. I've been trying to promote this idea in countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone. There's a lot of interest on the part of the government. The big impediment at the moment is the donor community, which is stuck in a very traditional mode of trying to put Humpty back together again, trying to rebuild the European state of the 1950s, and by NGOs, which are happy just to do their own thing, to go to Europe or America, get their funding, and then just do their own thing as a complete bypass for the society in which they operate. What I advocate, and it's sketched very briefly in the bottom billion, is to split up the functions that were previously envisaged as monopoly public supply. The planning of social provision should be left with the ministries, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, whatever. At the other end of the spectrum, supply at the retail level should be competitive, multiple channels, whatever works. And in between, you need an agency which I call independent service authorities, which channels public money to private provision in a sustainable, long-term basis. So that's the model that I think is the future model of social provision in these terrible environments. To close, all these ideas have three features. First, they harness business skills. Second, they harness public money. And thirdly, they make strategic sense. That is, if people did them, cumulatively, they would scale up to something that would transform these societies. Please try them, and please read the book. Thank you very much.